Now I'd like to introduce Ben of UKC Company, and particularly I want to ask him to explain how he sees the cultural differences that the Chinese visitor is looking for when they come to Europe to see, and whether they want to see that the main differences or whether they want to see that, to be honest, we're all the same across the whole world. Anyway, the very first question that I'm going to ask you, Ben, is what do you think are the main cultural differences between our two countries, our two areas, that's Europe and China?
Right, cultural differences. In general, Chinese tourists, like tourists from anywhere else in the world, when they're traveling, they just want to have a good time. However, if I have to point out a few cultural differences, it would be perhaps on their way they communicate and perhaps their body language as well. For example, Chinese tourists tend to talk very fast and very loudly when they're excited about something. This doesn't mean that they're rude at all, perhaps just a different way of expression. If you are a tour guide and a group of Chinese tourists standing very, very close to you, again, they're not trying to invade your personal space, but rather the concept of personal space is quite different culturally. And finally, I'd just like to give you an example in the language itself. Some Chinese people, when they are traveling, they just tend to translate whatever they have, into very simple English. So when you hear something like, give me this, go there, this doesn't mean that they're commanding you to do something. If anything, it's just the way they're trying to communicate in English. So I hope that these few pointers do help. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for that answer. It really helped to set the scene. I just want to now ask you further about what the trends that you can see they're developing, and again expanding on the what our Chinese visitors are looking for when they come to Europe.
So what do Chinese tourists like about Europe? Of course, Chinese tourists like the shopping in Europe, but increasingly they also like the food and drink offer and activities holidays. For the more sophisticated tourists, just being somewhere they can be away from the hustle and bustle of cities that they're used to is also something that they come to Europe for. One thing we do take it for granted living in Europe is the quality of our air. Many Chinese tourists I've met, they do comment on how refreshing just when they breathe in. I think that Europe as a luxury shopping paradise is pretty much established in China. What destination can really start selling are unique experiences. I mean, something that is unique to someone coming from China. It could be food and drink, it could be experience in the nature, or it could be activities like a day in a vineyard or even a photography course, things like that. With the power of social sharing in China, as long as there are opportunities to take great pictures, it will attract people. I would also say that I wouldn't be too worried about whether Chinese tourists like this type of activities or not like that type of activities. The Chinese population is so big and the projected number of outbound tourists are at such a level that I believe that no matter how niche your offer is, as long as it is good quality and it provides good experience, it will attract admirers.
Thank you, Ben. That's useful to hear the differences that we have between our two cultures. Now, I really want to find out the points that we need to be concerned about that maybe cut across the cultural differences and the things that we really must try and avoid when welcoming our Chinese visitors. Are there any taboos that we should consider? Some of us know that ghosts are something that the Chinese particularly are not keen to experience. I wonder whether this is of interest.
Right, so what makes Chinese tourists uncomfortable? Well, that's a really good question. In general, Chinese people don't like confrontation, and sometimes the lack of understanding of what certain action means can create confrontational situations. For example, many people know that Chinese people like to haggle when they shop, and sometimes haggling is just considered as part of the fun of shopping, and other times haggling is actually a buying signal. So sometimes a polite no is all you need, rather than an abrupt confrontation saying, no, this is not how it works in Europe. Another thing that Chinese people don't like is possibly being put on the spot. In general, Chinese people don't like losing face, and sometimes all they need is a little bit of a warm-up before they take part in certain activities. So what should we try to offer best service? Many in the industry already realize the habits of Chinese tourists. For example, they like hot breakfast, whether it's porridge or congee or full English, that sort of thing. But I would also say that if you're organizing a group tour, it's always good to give a clear itinerary with timings rather than giving Chinese tourists many options.
Thank you, Ben. That's good. And then just finally, a lot of people are now, the attractions are now looking to present and organise audio guides. Do you think these are important? We know that a lot of attractions are now having their brochures translated, and I think that the quality of the brochures that I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years has been much improved on what we used to see in the early days. But are there other things that our attractions and hotels should do in anticipation of the visitors that they hope to come to them from China?
If you're relatively new in receiving Chinese tourists, I would suggest you to go to more events from your sector organizations. You'll meet colleagues who has the experience, and people in tourism are generally very friendly, and most are very happy to share experiences. When it comes to having a strategy to target the Chinese market, you must find someone who actually understands Chinese tourists and their changing behavior. China is a fast developing country in many, many ways, and you don't want to be at the back foot of where you want to be in relation to attracting Chinese tourists.